With a slide that is perhaps somewhat shocking, and let me read it to you. It's a quotation, and I will tell you who the quote comes from. But it says, "In the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility, because the broad masses of a nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily. And thus, in the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victims to the big lie than the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies in little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts which prove this to be so may be brought clearly to their minds, they will still doubt and waver and will continue to think that there may be some other explanation." My dear friends, welcome to the post-truth, post-factual world of human imagination and hunger for power. The lines that I read just now come from no other than the master of lies and deceits, Adolf Hitler, one of the early champions and masterminds of post-factual communication, called populist propaganda. But it was only much later when we realized that our social, political, and even religious reality has shifted from paying attention to historical objective facts or our seeking thereof to emotional appeals based on skillfully tailored alternative truths. The shift in perception and communication had become so obvious in the past decade that in 2016 the Oxford Dictionary declared post-truth to be its international word of the year. According to the 2016 definition, post-truth is understood as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Next. This means, among other things, that official and what used to be credible institutions report incorrect or utterly false claims to change public opinion and harness support for specific groups or ideological preferences. Due to the rising influence of online social networks, a host of people with a public voice offer their expert opinion on just about anything without deeply understanding the matter and referring to available data. Celebrity status now outranks academic credential and rational critical discourse, and those presenting alternative facts as hardcore science or fact-based news reporting do not regard themselves as accountable for anything to anyone. Becoming post-truth is a convenience we afford ourselves. Facing honestly the reality around us as we approximate the truth, after all, can be painful. So we lie to everyone, especially to ourselves. We seem to be facing the following precarious situation. The post-colonial, post-Christendom, post-Holocaust, and post-Gulag societies are fearful of traditional solutions, based either on the ancient wisdom of sacred revelations or the modern light of allegedly objective reason, after the Enlightenment and empirical facts. But, on the other hand, following the seeming demise of ancient religious and modern secular meta-narratives, there is a widespread fear of chaos, nihilism, or even boredom. Next. So my presentation today is an attempt to identify and promote the insights of what we may call Christian Kenotic Agapeism. We can draw from the wealth of biblical tradition as well as the ideas of Christian intellectuals, including the Christian mystics, who saw the connection between love, agape, and Christology. And I will try to bring these ideas into conversation with two contemporary Canadian thinkers whom I find quite inspiring, Charles Taylor and Jordan Peterson. However, I want to reflect on selected insights of what it means to be in the truth in relation to Christian Kenotic Agapeism against the background of contemporary post-truth environment. And therefore, I will, the first part of my presentation will be on the war on truth and its various phases, and I will divide this part into two sections. The first one is the war on truth as a self-induced deception, and the second one is the war on truth from the side of ideologies. Yes. So let us first wrestle with the concept of truth and how it relates to freedom on the existential level of an individual. It is important to reflect on this critically because the capacity of our imagination enables us to both create and impose alternative worlds on ourselves and on others, inducing thereby a profound deception or self-deception that prevents us from being truly free and makes us both victims and perpetrators of the chaotic world around us. Entropy is not just a physical principle. Entropy affects also the moral, cultural, social, and political dimensions. Things fall apart, as the now famous psychiatrist and philosopher Jordan Peterson reminds us. And we speed the natural deterioration of great things through blindness, inaction, and deceit. Living in untruth, willfully spreading lies, corrupts us and the world. Without attention, culture degenerates and dies, and evil prevails. Yet, this is precisely what we see around us and in us quite often. People are living what Adler called a life lie, a calculated attempt to manipulate reality with perception, thought, and action, so that only some narrowly desired and predefined outcome is allowed to exist. There are two governing presuppositions of this kind of modern thinking, and they are on the screen on this slide. The first one is current knowledge is sufficient to define what is good, unquestioningly, far into the future. There are two problems pertaining to this point. First of all, we cannot be sure whether our imagined goal is truly noble and generally desirable. We cannot be sure that our current reflections and actions are good and at the same time conducive to our imagined goal. And the second one is that reality would be unbearable if left to its own devices. Yet, there is no way to conclusively know or prove if reality is intrinsically intolerable, and that it is as such can be successfully manipulated and distorted in line with our own imaginations. Such arrogant thinking elevates the faculty of rationality to the level of utmost pride. All I know is all that needs to be known. Pride falls in love with its own creations and tries to make them absolute. We tend to warp the reality of our own individual lives and, worse yet, that of our social environment to fit our fantasies, while refusing to accept that our fantasies may not correspond to the best possible account of reality, and that we get hurt and hurt others in the process of foolishly chasing after our fantasies. A life lie often starts from the naively formulated goal, which gradually transmutes into the sinister form of the life lie. So these three things often happen, as Peterson defines them. People tend to choose to believe, sometimes unwittingly, in a certain set of axioms that relates to their reality. Then they filter and screen their experiences and insist ever more narrowly that everything can be explained by these axioms. And still worse, they believe narcissistically, underneath all that bad theory, that the world could be put right if only they held the controls. Now, Viktor Frankl prophetically warned us that deceitful, inauthentic individual existence is the precursor to social totalitarianism. Alfred Adler knew it, knew that it was lies that bred sickness, physiologically speaking. In other words, lies warp the structure of being. Untruth corrupts the soul and the state alike, and one form of corruption feeds the other. And you can see this played out in human ideology. So now I want to turn very briefly to the second point of living in untruth when it comes to human ideologies. And we have had our experience with two comprehensive, fatal ideological narratives that ruled the Slovak society between 1939 and 1960. We had the ideology of Slovak fascism that was subservient to Hitler's Nazism, and then later on we had the ideology of communism. But my aim today is not to provide a comprehensive historical report. I merely wish to emphasize the power of an overarching narrative of reality that is based on deceitful axioms. And I want to point out the post-truth approach to reality that has already been here, that this post-truth approach to reality has already been here and has resulted in a colossal deception with brutal consequences. Also, I wish to ask the following critical question. Yes, the questions are on the screen. How is it possible that Nazism could have emerged and thrived in such highly educated and cultured Christian society as Germany was in early 1900s, and then have been so readily adopted in a clerical fascist form by the Slovak society? And should we agree with the rising number of prophetic voices that our societies might be closer to fascism than we are ready to admit, and that although the devil rarely shows himself twice in exactly the same way, our undying tendency to jump to final conclusions along some scientific political lines is just as scary now as it was back then? The Nazi meta-narrative may truly sound enticing to those flirting with the Nietzschean nihilism. We see this plainly from the following summary of Jean Bates' penetrating analysis of the roots of and power of the Nazi ideology. And let me show you the next slide. If the term, and this is from Jean Bates, it's a summary of his appraisal, evaluation of the Nazi ideology. He says, if the term human person is an illusion, everyone had better find their identity in a Volksstaat, people state. If society creates an individual, then let it be, and let all the respect towards human rights be substituted by propaganda. Let it manipulate humans and make them into what we want. If it is power alone that stands behind all of the institutions, let us take this power. If there is no overarching truth valid for all people, if race, or we may substitute class, or our religion, right? If this is the determining value, let us evaluate all of the ideas in the light of these interests: racial, class interests, religious interests, and usefulness. If societies are in essence racial, he says, let us be racist and let us try to rule over other races and people. Now, I see this dynamic in not just racism, as I mentioned, but in also other ideological struggles. So it is against these evil, and I'm going to skip over my closer analysis of communism at this point, but let's just conclude this section that it is against these evil reality manipulating ideologies that I wish to reflect upon what it means to be in the truth as based on the Christian Kenotic Agapeism. And I wish to propose a thesis that I will defend in what follows. Human solutions based strictly on the immanent frame are likely to be deficient. We need a solution that stays open to what might come from beyond our immanent secular frame. Hence the Christian talk of truth that sets you free, and its emphasis on Kenotic Agapeism as one inspirational example. And here I want to use especially Charles Taylor. So let us go to Christian. Oh, I can do this. Very nice. Okay. Christian Kenotic Agapeism. And this section is entitled Truth as a Precondition to Freedom. We need access to truth, imperfect as it may be, to defend ourselves from manipulation and self-deception. But this truth will not come in the guise of opinions shared by others, as the truth is neither a collection of slogans nor an ideology. It will be instead quite personal. And I follow the thoughts of Jordan Peterson here at this point. At the beginning of time, according to the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Word of God, Logos, transformed chaos into being through the act of speech. The Creator literally uttered the world into existence through his Logos, as both the Old Testament and New Testament texts witness. The same Logos who, in the fulfillment of time, became flesh and dwelt among us. And the same embodied Logos then gave the following promise to his followers. These are the words of Jesus. He says, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham. We have the correct religion. Come on, what are you talking about? And have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin, everyone who lives in self-deceit, deceitfulness, is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household, so there's no good future for this kind of slave. The Son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be made free indeed." The next key passage from the New Testament scripture shows us the core content of the truth that sets humans free according to the Christian tradition. It is from Philippians 2, verses 3 to 11. And again, I wish to have a look at these words. And this is from Apostle Paul. He says, Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Jesus Christ, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself. And here comes the word kenao, or in this form, ekenos and sauton, right? He emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. So this is the classic text for agapeic love, for this kenotic agapeism, that is not a principle, it's not an abstract idea for Christians, it is actually an embodied life that was lived historically. These words of the incarnated Logos, the truth made flesh, the agapeic love embodied to suffer for the sake of the other, constitute the foundation upon which Christian reflections on the kenotic nature of love develop. So notice the three closely intertwined truths or terms. First of all, truth, which is embodied in a life of love, but a specific kind of love called agape. And then the combination of truth and love engender genuine freedom as a way of being for the other, selflessly, even at the expense of emptying oneself, kenotic, dispossessing one's rights to selfish ambitions. Kenotic agapeism is this free movement of selfless sacrificial love that has hope for the world and the other and for oneself in the world. So let me repeat this thought again, because I believe it is crucial. Kenotic agapeism is a dynamic movement, a way of being, not just a set of abstract ideas. It is not enough to analyze it, reflect upon it, write about it, argue about it. One must start living it, be affected by it, to understand, to begin to understand its essence. Hence the title of this presentation, Being in the Truth as a Path to Freedom. Paul of Tarsus, the apostle, develops this idea further by speaking of a mystical union between the believer and the living Logos. In Galatians 2, he says, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. When this mystical union happens in faith, and for Paul, this is not merely on the cognitive level, but a deeply existential, even ontological level, a new reality emerges, a new life of freedom to humbly accept the contingencies and limitations of this world and of oneself, and a new freedom to love even one's own enemies. Perhaps the most known passage from Paul on this is in 2 Corinthians 5. It's the last passage from the Christian scripture that I want to quote. So if anyone is in Christ, if anyone is united and Christo, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. All this is from God, so it is not self-induced, but rather we are the receivers, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. So we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. This idea of being God's ambassadors is important because this calling, this mandate, is closely related with the idea of a new freedom of the new creation in Christ. Since the human being is as man and woman made in the image of God, humans have both the mandate and capacity to transform chaos into being through truthful speech about themselves and about what is around them. As Peterson rightly reminds us, and I quote from him, to tell the truth is to bring the most habitable reality into being. Truth builds edifices that can stand 1,000 years. Truth feeds and clothes the poor and makes nations wealthy and safe. Truth reduces the terrible complexity of a man to the simplicity of his word, so that he can become a partner rather than an enemy. Truth makes the past truly past and makes the best use of the future's possibilities. Truth is the ultimate, inexhaustible natural resource. It is the light in the darkness. The truth will keep your soul from withering and dying while you encounter the inevitable tragedy of life. It will help you avoid the terrible desire to seek vengeance for that tragedy. Neither blind adherence to an ideology, whether religious or secular, nor a cynical and somewhat desperate refuge in nihilism can bring a deep satisfaction stemming from a life in the truth that sets us free. So again, truth, freedom, and love go together. We can only be in the truth because of love incarnate. Kenotic Agapeism is always personal. It is always about relationships. Our contingencies imply, and our shared human experience confirms, that we are essentially relational beings. As biopsychosocial beings, we are born with an intrinsic porosity, and I'm using here Charles Taylor's term, porosity, openness. Being able to receive with trust the self-communication of others. And the Christians would say the transcendent other. Thus, human person is fundamentally relational, even before one develops his capacity of self-awareness. My being as the being of a human person is a gift of love relationships. My parents, for example. Before I was born, a psychobiological connection was established between my mother and I. I was born out of a relationship of love into relationships of love within my family and my society. The intimate other's relation to me is constitutive to myself, my emerging personhood. I derive my sense of security, my belonging, through an elementary relationship of trust that is developing between my mother and I. Some developmental psychologists call this psychological imprinting, which is similar to and yet much more complex than the merely instinctive imprinting in birds and other animals. Before being fully aware of myself, before the thinking, feeling, willing I, there is a trusting I. A sense of elementary security and belonging of the emerging self enabled by a fundamental porosity of my being. This trusting I is established by the relationship of the intimate other to me. This initial and continuous relatedness of the other to me is a fundamental endowment that helps me become who I am as person. Myself thus emerges as a result of others' selves relating to me and my reciprocal relating to them. Now, when we live in lies and when we are lied to, when we live in deceit, both self-induced and imposed, we distort who we are and lose the freedom to live in mutual relationships of love and trust for which we have been born. The frustration, fear, insecurities, and anger that arise from our situation of untruth and unfreedom result in broken relationships, broken lives, and a corrupted reality. It takes intentional acts, intentional implementation of the bestowed and appropriated freedom to be in the truth, to change one's way of being in the world. Intellectual reflection severed from the corrective principles of humility and charity, which is a civil form of love, and detached from practical actions will likely result in proud absolutizations of one's rational schemes, ideologizations of one's incomplete perceptions and assessments, especially in such reflection, if such reflection is conducted strictly within what Taylor calls an immanent frame. So we now move to the next section entitled The Kenotic Shape of Taylor's Conception of Transcendence. Taylor's conception of transcendence exhibits two main characteristics. It remains committed to the needs and demands of religious pluralism, and it has a kenotic form that engenders an ethics that stresses embodied enactments of the agapeic love. It is the second one which we must especially notice. We may follow Colorado on this point, lifting up Taylor's assertion in The Sources of the Self that if moderns are to overcome the Nietzschean dilemma, they need to make a successful case for agape, or a secular iteration of it. Transcendence as personal transformation, motivated by the Christian concept of agape, results in a new quality of human embodied encounters. This embodied encounter establishes a relationality that is constituted by an agapeic spontaneity, a freedom enacted in love, but for the neighbor. The right kind of spontaneity is then established by a transformative and constitutive encounter with transcendence. Now, Taylor's religious understanding of transcendence, understood as transformation in the shape of kenotic love, this kind of renouncing, aiming beyond life, which not only takes you away from life's contingencies, but brings you back to flourishing, as Taylor reminds us of Catholic modernity, is an important concept. In Christian terms, if renunciation decenters you in relation with God, God's will is that humans flourish, and so you are taken back to an affirmation of this flourishing, which is biblically called agape. In Buddhist terms, enlightenment doesn't just turn you from the world, Taylor says, it also opens the floodgates of metta, loving kindness, and karuna, compassion. Taylor is thus convinced that there is a kind of transcendence that does not thwart human flourishing. On the contrary, there remains the possibility of an openness to agapeic transcendence that promotes the very affirmation of ordinary life. The central challenge today is how to make these terms, in which transcendence and human flourishing go together, comprehensible and credible to a society that maybe has lost touch with this kind of language. Agapeic transcendence is distinguishable mainly by its emphasis on self-giving and loving submission. We can trace this emphasis back to the New Testament, and Taylor points out Philippians 2, the text we have just read. And this is what Taylor says on this topic. Now, Christ's reaction to the resistance, which is natural, which comes when you try to live out this kind of life, was to offer no counter-resistance, but to continue loving and offering. This love can go to the very heart of things and open a road even for the resistors. Through this loving submission, violence is turned around, and instead of breeding counter-violence in an endless spiral, it can be transformed. A path is opened for non-power, limitless self-giving, full action, and infinite openness. On the basis of this initiative, the incomprehensible healing power of this suffering, it becomes possible for human suffering, even of the most meaningless type, to become associated with Christ's act and to become a locus of renewed contact with God, an act which heals the world. The suffering is given a transformative effect by being offered to God. A similar idea comes from another important thinker, Karol Wojtyla, who says, love is capable of creating a real and enduring community of persons, one in which the individual takes moral responsibility for himself and others. This holds on the intimate level of familial affections, the social level of solidarity between individuals and groups, and even the more general level of concern for the natural world. Exclusive humanism, on the other hand, is incapable of cultivating this kind of moral responsibility because it ultimately promotes the opposite of love, egoism. Egoism inevitably becomes the source of indifference, for anything which transcends the self. This essential indifference of egoism makes it incapable of motivating love or sustaining true charity. This explains with more clarity, according to Paula Olearnik from Slovenia, why Rorty's proposal of expanding circles of empathy as a way of fostering solidarity and responsibility is ineffective. This Olearnik is reacting to liberal secularist alternatives to this kind of agapeic love. And she says the following. She says, since we often hurt those who are closest to us, cruelty cannot be explained simply as the failure to recognize our own likeness in those we cause to suffer. The failure to love is sometimes due to hate, but more often than not, it is the result of egoism. We may sometimes need to better appreciate the likeness of other individuals and groups to our own, but more often we must conquer our own self-love. The question is, how is this overcoming of self-love possible? If an exclusive humanism, as exclusive humanism has it, there is no further horizon beyond self-interest and imminent gratification. Olearnik further reminds us how difficult it is for Western intellectuals to think in terms of love, or love as sacrifice that may include sacrificial suffering for the other. Western intellectuals seem to gladly settle for justice, and they will talk endlessly about social justice and keep the discourse on this topic. But justice does not seem to call for sacrifice or suffering on the part of the morally aware subjects. It merely calls for a minimal moral restraint. While commendable as such, this minimal moral restraint does not seem to be sufficiently conducive to cultivating fertile ground for deep solidarity. Solidarity within and between nations can only come about if we cease stifling the moral intuitions that come out of the deepest cultural and religious experiences of those people. Exclusive humanism is not only unwilling, but appears to also be unable to reflect and engage in meaningful dialogues where this deeper dimension is present. As Elizabeth Elstein points out, if we presume that we are the sole and only ground of our own being, we deny dependence on others, beginning with that other who made us in his own image, which in turn invites a refusal of authentic companionship among people. Therefore, the proliferation of varied forms helps us to compensate for our own narrowness. We may agree with Colorado and Elstein that by connecting the demands of kenosis to pluralism, Taylor's program, like Augustine's, through an attunement to the demands of the Imago Dei, takes a path that is ultimately weary of triumphalism and self-sufficiency. So let me offer some concluding remarks. 2 more slides. To be in the truth is to be transformed by the truth incarnate, whom Christians call Christ, the embodied Logos of God. To be in the truth means to live out the truth, though ever so imperfectly, as free children of God. To be in the truth is to learn to recognize one's deficiencies and brokenness, as well as the deficiencies and brokenness of the neighbor, religious and secular, and to embrace them humbly as we receive and share the selfless love of the one who has emptied himself for our sake, freely and unreservedly. This Kenotic Agapeism never leads to arrogant triumphalism. And if it does, then it's not Kenotic Agapeism. It's not Christian love. So it never leads to arrogant triumphalism, which was evident even in the well-meant missionary efforts of Western cultural and religious colonialism. Instead, it leads us to epistemic humbleness when it comes to our perceiving and evaluating our own givenness and limitations. It leads us to humility in our conversations with the others, from every tribe and language, in a truly dialogical hermeneutic inquiry, in a Gadamerian style, where the conversation is open. And it leads us to selfless sacrificial service, concrete acts of love to all, even those whom we may consider as unworthy of our kindness. The first act of love towards a stranger is careful listening, is listening with generosity and openness to mutual exploration. Those participating in this conversation are trying to solve the problem instead of insisting on the a priori validity of their own positions. All are acting on the premise that they have something to learn from each other. This kind of conversation constitutes active philosophy, the highest form of thought and the best preparation for proper living, as Peterson puts it. So living in a post-truth world of rising populism, propagandist manipulation, and religious fundamentalism, I believe that we can let ourselves be inspired by the narrative urgency and existential power of Christian Kenotic Agapeism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Michal. So the floor is open for 10 minutes of questions. Yes, Professor John.
Thank you, Professor Michael. Very fascinating. I have a provocative question for you. How can a idealistic concept like kenosis be truth if truth is what actually is, as opposed to truth being what ought to be? In other words, people don't act according to kenotic values, right? I mean, generally speaking. Paul was a very bad family man. He was a wandering guy who wouldn't have a wife, who kept beating his body, wandered from place to place, didn't have any money. He was a failure, a social failure in one sense, right? So kenosis isn't a popular idea. So, but what is truth, in other words, to quote Pilate? What is truth? Isn't truth what is? I mean, if you contrast Adam Smith. Adam Smith, there is no Adam Smith problem. There is no contradiction between his theory of moral sentiments and his Wealth of Nations, because he really just observes the way people act out of self-interest and moral sympathy to one another, and work out this equilibrium according to the invisible hand. There's nothing idealistic or hortatory about his system. Kenosis is extremely idealistic in that way. And do you see any contradictions?
Yes, thank you for a wonderful provocative question. Obviously, there is a tension. I wouldn't say there is a contradiction. For me, this would be perhaps too strong of a word, but I definitely see a tension, as we all do. If we have a high ideal of the truth, similar to or equal with the Christian ideal of kenotic agape, and then we look at ourselves and we look around us, we don't see this. We see that there is a big divide, big difference between these two realities. On one hand, it's this ideal. On the other hand, it's the reality of my life, right? So we all live in this tension, with this tension, and yet we all live by some ideals, whether we articulate them clearly or whether we simply take them as implicit, and there are some motivational forces in us and around us that drive us. And so it is, I think, helpful if we analyze these motivational forces. And even though we can never reach fully this kind of ideal, because, to the question that Pilate asks, what is truth? Now, that's a big irony in that situation, that Pilate should ask this question when the truth stood in front of him, embodied, incarnated, right? But he asked the question in the wrong way. Not what is truth, but who is truth? Well, Jesus is the truth from Christian perspective, and so the only way we can relate to this truth really is personally. And I believe this is what Paul and the text that I quoted wanted to say, that this is a long path, a path of humility, where we never own the truth. As soon as Christians start believing that they own the truth, they become triumphalistic and oppressive. We don't own the truth. We are invited to follow, we are invited to be transformed by the truth, but this truth is always outside of us and is given to us as a gift, which we need to receive every day in a new way, and we need to relate it to outer circumstances. We need to be realistic too. But of course, we live with this kind of tension. But that's what makes life interesting and exciting, to live in this kind of tension. But should we simply give up on aspiring to be moved by this highest, and I don't want to say ideal, but this highest embodiment of truth that comes to us in Logos? Should we give up on this? I don't think we should, but we need to be realistic and always say, I am unworthy. My understanding and my relationship to this truth is always limited and thwarted by my ambition and my misunderstandings and so on. Therefore, humility is the key word in all of this discourse. Humility. And I believe that if a person doesn't stay alone, but lives in a vibrant, living Christian community, where the truth can be embodied in the relationships of Christians together, this can create a fertile ground for this kind of agapeic, kenotic agapeism to actually start emerging and becoming inspirational to people around that community. So I think this is the way to go.
Okay, thank you. Please, Professor Olga.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Michal, for your profound presentation, but I have two questions which are connected with one another. First question. I come back to the first part of your presentation, yes? And it seems that some principles and some notions that you underlined here are similar to the postmodernists' concept and notions. Can we use these notions notions for explanation of post-truth world? I mean postmodernist notions. Are these notions similar to them? And a second, if I understood you clearly, the Christian Agapeism is something different from the way of post-truth conceptions and postmodernist conception. I agree completely with you, but if we use these conceptions of Agapeism only for faithful people, but there are a lot of people in the world who are not faithful, but they need the way for explanation and elucidation of this world. What is the correct way? What is the truth way for them? How we can explain this world for them? And my second question was the same. What is truth? But I want to just to detail what is objective truth. Is objective truth for all of us really exist? Because Agapeism, you said, it is personal way, individual way. What is objective way for us? Thank you.
Oh wow, thank you. Yeah, huge questions.
Yes.
Let's organize 2 more conferences on that. Let me just give you my very limited and sort of concise attempt at answering your questions. So the first one, postmodernism versus post-truth. I believe they overlap, obviously, but it's not completely the same. There's some distinctions. For example, I believe that in the ideologies that I mentioned in the 20th century, the ideologies that cost millions of dead people were not postmodernist, they were actually modernist. They were the children of enlightenment. So they believed they could actually own the truth of history, whether it's racial or class struggle or whatever it would be, but they, in a modernist type of way, they believed they held the key to history. But in order to convince the critical mass of people to follow them, what causes this feedback?
The next, the second microphone.
Oh, the second microphone. Yeah, in order to convince the critical mass of people to follow them, they used this kind of methodology of, well, let's use propaganda, let's appeal to the fears or emotions or some low desires of people, and maybe I'll just shout. Yeah. Or maybe it's a sign that we should stop. Right? So they knew how to manipulate people, and in that sense they worked with this post-truth methodology, but they themselves were modernists. Whereas a typical postmodern intellectual would doubt that there is a key to history, that there is a comprehensive sort of meta-narrative that I can hold on to, so in that sense it's different. But of course, in the age of postmodernism, this kind of post-truth methodology of communication and manipulation is very much at home, right? But there is a difference between the ideologies I mentioned and what is happening today. Yes, how do we, if I understand you correctly, the second question, how do we enact this kind of Christian agapeism toward you call them the unfaithful, or the people who are outside and who are
Outside of religion.
Outside of religion, secular
Just
people,
secular.
or right? Okay, yeah. I would say that not necessarily in a discursive way, showing some arguments and comparing some abstract concepts, but rather more on the local and existential level, where, as we had our conversations here before, I believe we can show some inspirational examples of personal lives and community lives, where families stay strong despite problems will be everywhere, but where people can act selflessly, caringly, even in difficult situations, and other people can notice. And we have seen this in our small local context, when we take our church community in Martin takes care of some old people who are lonely, who are sick, and their own children don't have time or don't care about them. And these are 80-plus-year-olds who live in the town, and they don't necessarily belong to the Christian community, okay? But they have friends who do, and they tell the people in the church, and they have this deaconal program of bringing meals to them, speaking to them, caring for them, taking them to the hospital. But they're not part of the community, and yet people sacrifice. They do it as volunteers. They sacrifice their time and money sometimes to take them to the hospital or to bring them food. And then their children ask about what's happening. Why are these people doing this for you? So, of course, now this is not going to solve all the world's problems, and it's not going to work 100% on everyone. But we have had cases where people started becoming more open to the Christian way of thinking and living because of what they saw that the Christian community did for their parents or their children. Okay, so instead of having this discourse where we compare concepts, which can also be done on the university level, sure. But I think what is more inspirational and will work better is to actually have living communities that embody this truth. This truth needs to be embodied in my life, your life, my family, our community, and that can be inspirational.
Thank you. Another short question because we must take the coffee break. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. A very short question. So, the truth protects from post-truth world. I agree with you. Then, the truth, what is the truth? The truth is humble love, including listening to the other, but not imposing our truth upon him. I agree with you. But is it going to lead us to the plurality of truth, which is the first step to the post-truth?
Yeah, very good. Yeah. I would tend to go back to Charles Taylor as sort of my inspiration and my teacher, and call to our attention his term personal resonance. Personal resonance. And I would say that if pluralism of truth is our goal, then it's not going to lead us anywhere. We just end up in some post-truth reality, which is not going to be helpful. But so at the same time, you don't have convincing proofs for your own opinion or narrative, right? Not conclusively convincing. Like this is not hard science that you explain to people. This is the narrative of the gospel is the history of the world, and everybody should do it this way. So instead, you tell your story, you live your life, and in this conversation and in this mutual sharing of our shared humanity, it creates some personal resonance in your hearers, in your listeners, or in your observers, and then we can build on this personal resonance. Does it resonate? The story that I just told about the old people and how they are cared for, was there some personal resonance on the human level, not on a kind of ideological level, but a human level? Now I believe that some people at least, they would say, yeah, it resonated in me. I would like to be caring like this, or I would like my parents to be taken care of this way. So what kind of motivation can I find amongst the secular ideologies or religious narratives that would make me such a person, right? So maybe this will be the approach. Let's have an open conversation, but not with the goal of a plurality of truths, but rather with the goal of reaching some mutually shared and experienced viewpoint where this kind of personal resonance principle will help us go closer to the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.